What if I told you that everything you believed was untrue? These majestic mansions, symbols of the Victorian era, luxury and power of the British Empire, were actually architectural disasters. They were not bastions of comfort and warmth, as depicted in films, but rather cold stone traps where the owners constantly battled dampness and drafts. Behind their ornate facades lay monstrous construction errors, absurd insulation schemes, and a constant icy hell inside the rooms we are so accustomed to romanticizing. Watch the video to the end and you will learn the true cost, expressed in sweat, pain, and lives, of simply building a roof over one's head in Victorian England. Are you ready to learn the truth about what made these mansions not luxurious homes, but veritable refrigerators? It is important to understand that Victorian architecture was obsessed with appearance and monumentality. The main goal was to impress neighbors and show status, not to provide comfort for living. As a result, builders paid great attention to complex facades, stone carvings, and an abundance of decorative elements, completely ignoring practical issues such as insulation. Stone or brick was typically used as the primary material, and this was the first and foremost curse of the Victorian mansion. Stone walls, especially thick ones, have high thermal conductivity and do not retain heat inside. They not only cool down themselves, but also actively suck heat out of the interior, creating an ice bag effect, even if there is a bright fire burning in the fireplace. At that time, there was no effective waterproofing technology as we know it today. Builders did not use vapor barrier membranes or modern insulation, which led to disastrous consequences. Moisture from the soil and rainwater easily penetrated the walls, making them constantly damp. A wet wall cools even faster, turning the mansion into an ideal environment for mold and mildew, as well as intensifying the feeling of piercing cold. Many architects made serious design mistakes that only exacerbated the problem. Huge high ceilings, which were supposed to symbolize grandeur, created a huge, inefficient volume that was impossible to heat. Warm air rose, leaving an icy draft and constant dampness below, at the level of the residence. Another element that turned the mansion into an icy labyrinth was the abundance of corridors and staircases. These spaces were rarely heated. They served as a buffer between the living rooms, but in reality were constant sources of cold that penetrated all parts of the house, reminding every member of the family of their presence. The situation was exacerbated by the fact that the heating system was primitive. The main source of heat was the fireplace, which was actually extremely inefficient. Most of the heat simply went up the chimney along with the smoke, and the fireplace itself created a constant draft, drawing cold air in through the cracks in the windows and doors. To combat this, the owners installed heavy curtains and plugged the gaps with fabric. This was not for decoration, but a desperate measure to retain some heat. Even in wealthy homes, people sat in several layers of clothing, preferring the comfort of small rooms that could be heated in some way. It is interesting that with such a total lack of insulation, builders managed to create unique and, from our point of view, unimaginable structures. For example, in some mansions, you can find secret rooms or hidden passages, which added intrigue but also made the house even more complex and inefficient in terms of heat loss. It was an era when aesthetics completely defeated pragmatism. People sacrificed their comfort and health for the sake of external beauty and conformity to social expectations. They lived in conditions that seem unthinkable to us today, considering it the norm for their high status. Do you think such housing can be considered a model of architectural success, given all these inconveniences? Share your opinion in the comments and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Ready to learn the main secret that turned every Victorian mansion into a house that was blown through by all the winds? The secret was not hidden in the walls, doors, or even the huge fireplace shafts, but in a completely different element. The problem was the windows. luxurious, majestic, mesmerizing, but at the same time perhaps the most vulnerable part of all these monumental structures. Victorians loved large, tall windows, real glass walls that flooded rooms with daylight and emphasized the status of the owner. In an era when electric lighting was just taking its first steps, these giant openings were the only way to fill a house with any brightness at all. They perfectly matched the aesthetics of grandeur, refinement, and harmony of proportions, but at the same time created catastrophic problems in terms of heat conservation. At that time, the double or triple glazing technology that has become the gold standard today did not yet exist. The vast majority of houses use single glazing, thin, fragile, and highly heat conductive. It could not serve as a serious barrier to the cold. In winter, the glass literally became an ice plate through which heat left the room almost without resistance. The surface of the glass froze so much that cold air, coming into contact with it, instantly cooled and sank down. This continuous flow, combined with the upward movement of warm air, created the effect of a miniature internal hurricane, constant vertical convection currents that residents felt as a real icy blow to their feet and backs. But that was far from the only problem. The design of Victorian windows was inherently flawed. The most common were casement windows on counterweights, sliders that were raised and lowered by a system of ropes and weights hidden inside boxes. The design was elegant, convenient, and technically revolutionary for its time, but completely unsealed by nature. Gaps inevitably remained between the wooden frames and the movable sashes. Even the thinnest cracks allowed cold air to freely enter the house. When the wind picked up, these gaps turned into ventilation shafts, through which drafts swept through the rooms as if the windows were wide open. No curtains, not even heavy velvet drapes could help. The cold found its way everywhere. The builders, of course, tried to combat this problem using primitive sealants, felt, resin, woven cords. But they were short-lived. After a few seasons, they dried out, cracked, and fell out. The wooden frames themselves behaved like living material. They dried out in winter and swelled from humidity in summer. All this increased the gaps, turning the windows into constant sources of drafts and heat loss. The situation was particularly difficult in rooms facing north or exposed to direct winds. It was almost impossible to live there. Furniture was placed away from windows, people slept under several blankets, and daytime activities were moved to warmer parts of the house. In particularly harsh winters, the windows were covered with paper, cloth, or even cotton wool, turning the luxurious mansion into a kind of fortified stronghold, fighting against the cold. But the main problem lay in a simple fact. Large windows are a huge source of heat loss. Even if they were perfectly sealed, which was impossible, heat still escaped through the single pane of glass. It was practically impossible to heat a room, especially a spacious salon or ballroom. The fireplaces worked continuously, consuming incredible amounts of coal, and the heating bills sometimes ruined the owners. Such was Victorian reality. The beauty of the facade and the grandeur of the architecture came at the price of constant internal discomfort. The splendor of the facade coexisted with cold, dampness, and the eternal struggle for comfort and warmth. The irony was that the symbol of wealth was also a symbol of chilly nights in the icy breath of winter. But here's the paradox. The problem with windows was also linked to another widespread belief of the time. Victorians firmly believed that a constant supply of fresh air, even if it was freezing, was necessary for health and prevented disease. Therefore, houses were deliberately made unsealed. However, knowledge of the terrain, climate, and materials was only half the problem. The real nightmare lay elsewhere, in how builders turned ordinary rainwater into one of the main and most insidious enemies of Victorian mansions. Want to know why rain could destroy a house faster than any draft? I will reveal the best-kept secret about how builders turned ordinary rain into a powerful destroyer of Victorian mansions. This aspect of construction was one of the biggest and most fatal flaws of the era. We are talking about the drainage system and the mistakes that turned majestic walls into a breeding ground for dampness. Victorian roofs were complex. Numerous turrets, bay windows, and slopes created a huge number of joints and corners. It was in these places, due to poor quality or incorrectly installed ceiling, that the first leaks began. Water, penetrating inside, began to slowly but surely destroy the rafters and floors. But the biggest problem was vertical moisture. At that time, there was no effective technology to protect the foundation and walls from moisture rising from the ground. Today, we use waterproofing layers, but back then, they were rare or non-existent. As a result, the foundation and lower floors constantly absorbed groundwater like a sponge. This moisture rose up through the capillaries of brick or stone masonry and penetrated the walls. This phenomenon is called capillary rise. On interior walls, it manifested itself in the form of dark spots, peeling plaster, and a characteristic musty smell of dampness. External drainage systems were often primitive or became clogged over time. Rainwater flowing off the roof was not always effectively drained away from the foundation, but simply accumulated around it. This in turn increased the amount of moisture absorbed by the walls. Building in damp and low-lying areas, which was common practice due to the high cost of land, exacerbated this problem. In such places, the water table was high, and the houses were effectively standing in a swamp. No measures taken subsequently could completely solve this problem. The lack of effective ventilation in basements and ground floors also played a role. Moisture accumulated in the walls could not evaporate and built up. This created ideal conditions for the rotting of wooden beams and structures. In some mansions, the supporting structures began to collapse within a few decades after construction. Mansion owners often tried to mask the problem by re-wallpapering or repainting the walls, but this was only a temporary measure. Moisture inevitably returned, leaving its mark. It was a constant, exhausting battle against an invisible enemy. Thus, the majestic stone facade, of which the Victorians were so proud, was not a protection, but rather a curse. It absorbed moisture, prevented it from evaporating, and became a conductor of cold. The true uniqueness of Victorian architecture, unfortunately, lay in its ability to turn water into its main internal enemy. Like this video if you've ever encountered this problem in old houses. Guess what happened next when the ambitions of architects collided with the imperfections of the technology of the time? What happened when artists tried to play engineers without modern calculations, simulation programs, or materials capable of forgiving mistakes? Unlike today's construction projects where everything is calculated down to the last bolt, Victorian mansions often fell hostage to the bold ideas, personal ambitions, and limited engineering knowledge of their creators. In those days, architecture was not only a profession, but also a way to make a statement. Everyone wanted to build a house that would stand out from the rest, taller, wider, richer, more complex. Such projects look stunning on paper. Gothic spires, grandiose arches, heavy balconies, round turrets, decorative battlements, and reliefs. But reality quickly put everything in its place. Many solutions, drawn with inspiration, turned out to be doomed to failure as soon as they encountered rain, frost, and the force of gravity. One of the most common mistakes was incorrect load distribution. Decorative elements, stone bay windows, massive parapets, multi-tiered balconies, weighed tons. Literally, architects often treated them as ordinary decorations rather than structural elements. As a result, walls that were supposed to withstand uniform pressure became overloaded at certain points. This led to uneven settlement of the building. Facades began to float, corners collapsed, and characteristic diagonal cracks appeared. In advanced cases, individual elements simply collapsed, especially after winters, when water entering microcracks froze and expanded, destroying the masonry from the inside. The next disaster was heating. In Victorian houses, fireplaces were everywhere. In bedrooms, living rooms, hallways, sometimes even in bathrooms. Each room had its own chimney, and they all intertwined into a giant maze inside the walls. On paper, it looked like a masterpiece of engineering, but in practice, it turned into a source of endless problems. Chimneys were often made too long, with lots of bends to fit into the architecture. This impaired the draft, and when the draft dropped, the fireplace began to smoke into the room. Mansion owners complained that they woke up covered in soot and that their curtains always smelled of smoke. Not only that, but due to poor draft, the heat went into the walls instead of the rooms, warming the bricks rather than the people. Ventilation was another weak link. Victorians believed that fresh air was the best remedy for disease, but they did not know how to control its flow. Instead of a well-designed ventilation system, architects created a chaotic network of openings, shafts, and ducts that functioned more like pipes for cold air. As a result, the house literally sucked the cold from the street, turning the rooms into something like cold storage rooms. Drafts roamed the corridors like living creatures, and residents fought them endlessly with curtains, screens, and carpets, not realizing that the cause lay in the very structure of the building. The problems were exacerbated by inexperience in the use of new materials. During the Industrial Revolution, builders began to use reinforced concrete and metal beams, but not everyone realized the need for compensation gaps for temperature changes. The choice of site caused no less trouble. Architects sometimes built houses on hills so that they would look majestic, but they forgot that the wind is particularly strong at the top. It was impossible to live in such houses in winter. The wind blew against the walls with such force that it seemed as if the house was vibrating. The cold penetrated through the slightest gap, turning luxurious living rooms into ice caves. Other houses were built at the foot of slopes, where moisture accumulated, causing basements to be constantly flooded and walls to become covered with mold. And finally, there was supervision. Victorian England did not have modern quality standards. Contractors could use less durable materials, deviate from the design, or simplify structural elements if they wanted to save money or speed up the work. The architect often only found out about these changes years later, when the house began to fall apart before his eyes. Hidden defects manifested themselves gradually but inevitably. As a result, many Victorian mansions, however grand and impressive they may have been, were giant architectural experiments. Beautiful on the outside, problematic on the inside. Their owners often fell victim to engineering mistakes that no one talked about openly. With each passing year, these miscalculations became more and more apparent. Some balustrades cracked, some masonry shifted, and in some places the cold lived in the house as steadily as the owners themselves. In the next chapter, you will learn how Victorians tried to cope with this terrible weather, with houses that worked against them, and the methods they resorted to will surely surprise you. This constant daily struggle with cold and damp was an integral part of life in Victorian mansions, and it affected literally every aspect of daily life. The indoor temperature in some rooms during the winter months could barely exceed the outside temperature, and sometimes it was even lower. In such conditions, it took remarkable patience and constant ingenuity to maintain even a reasonable level of comfort. Clothing was the second front in the battle. People wore many layers of woolen and thick clothing, even inside the house. Men did not take off their jackets and vests, and women wore thick, long dresses and shawls. Thermal underwear, as we know it today, did not exist at that time, and layering was the only way to retain the heat generated by the body. Another important tool was portable heaters and screens. Small coal stoves or oil heaters were carried from room to room. Screens were placed near windows and doors to block the flow of cold air and drafts, at least a little. Dampness was just as big a problem as the cold. Moisture condensed on cold walls and windows, creating a musty smell and damaging furniture and books. To combat this, dehumidifiers were used, usually in the form of chemicals that absorb moisture. This was labor-intensive and ineffective. Servants also played a huge role in this struggle. Their morning began long before their masters rose. They had to light the fireplaces, bring coal, fill the bed warmers, and prepare hot tea. Keeping the mansion warm was a complex logistical process that required constant labor. Heavy canopies were often used over the beds in the bedrooms. Not only did they give the room a majestic look, but they also had a practical function. They created a small enclosed space that could be warmed up with body heat and hot water bottles. Thus, life in a Victorian mansion was a daily feat. Idealistic notions of comfort and luxury were shattered by the harsh reality of icy floors, drafts, and constant dampness. The external grandeur concealed internal inefficiency and discomfort. Guess what happened next when the castle had to be built in the shortest possible time? When the client demanded the impossible, the architect promised miracles, and the builders, simple, exhausted people, became the last link in the chain of insane ambitions? We talk about the luxury, splendor, and grandeur of Victorian mansions, but we rarely remember that behind each of them stood the superhuman labor of thousands of workers. It was on their shoulders that the entire burden of imperfect technology, lack of mechanization, and relentless construction pace fell. The Victorian era was a time of construction boom, almost a mania for creating monumental architecture. Cities grew, and wealthy industrialists competed with each other in the scale and luxury of their homes. The demand for mansions was so high that contractors sought to complete projects as quickly as possible, not for the sake of quality, but for the sake of payment. Speed became the measure of success, and the price of that speed was paid by those who worked 20 hours a day, often without days off or breaks, armed only with the most primitive tools. Every material, every brick, every log, and every stone block was delivered by hand. There were no tower cranes, no freight elevators, no concrete mixers. Hundreds of men carried heavy stones on their backs, using simple blocks, ropes, and wooden ramps. Lifting massive elements became a painful, slow ordeal, where a mistake could cost a life. Working conditions were truly appalling. Construction sites in those days were more like chaotic places where death lurked at every turn. The ground was littered with debris, sharp tools, and uncovered pits. Falls from heights were so common that they were almost considered an inevitable part of the job. Scaffolding collapses occurred regularly, and the quality of the boards used to assemble them often left much to be desired. Safety standards, as we understand them today, were simply non-existent. No helmets, safety harnesses, or warning barriers, all of which would have been considered an unnecessary luxury and a waste of money. Workers suffered not only from physical risks, but also from constant illnesses caused by working conditions. Stone and coal dust corroded their lungs. Dampness and cold led to rheumatism, chronic colds, and constant inflammation. The lime used daily by plasterers and bricklayers caused skin burns, eye irritation, and long-term health problems. People coughed, sneezed, lost their eyesight, and often died young. But construction continued because deadlines were looming. The quality of materials was also often sacrificed for the sake of economy. Brick manufacturers could overfire or underfire their products, making them brittle. The mortar was prepared by eye, and an error in the proportions meant that entire walls began to crack and lean after a few weeks. Foremen often forced workers to redo huge sections of masonry, work that, of course, was not paid for additionally. Just as often, the foremen themselves hid defects in order to deliver the project to the customer on time. Their hands created the beauty that later delighted guests and owners. But despite their incredible skill, their work remained almost invisible and was extremely poorly paid. Unique skills passed down from generation to generation were valued less than the timely delivery of a project. The social gap between builders and mansion owners was enormous. When the owners moved into their new homes, admiring the stucco moldings, oak staircases, and mirrored galleries, the workers who had created all this splendor returned to their poor, overcrowded neighborhoods. There, dampness, disease, hunger, and unsanitary conditions reigned. Dozens of families lived in one slum building next to factories where the air was thick with smoke and fumes. The life of a worker was a constant risk. Any injury could instantly cut off access to income. A dropped hammer, a cut from a tool, a twisted leg, and the whole family was left without means. There was no insurance, no pensions, no compensation. Thus, the Victorian mansion was a monument not only to luxury, but also to the incredible endurance, perseverance, and sacrifice of those who built it. Every stone wall, every cornice, every turret, all of these hold invisible stories of blood, sweat, and pain. In the next chapter, we will talk about how these people survived under conditions of enormous stress and chaos. Their improvised logistics system, division of labor, and amazing ways of keeping construction moving forward despite everything. Contrary to what one might expect, the interior of a Victorian mansion often concealed another critical problem: the imperfection of early sewage systems. Although these systems were a step forward compared to the Middle Ages, they were primitive and posed a serious threat to the health of the inhabitants. The first indoor water closets, which were considered a symbol of progress and luxury, were often connected to leaky pipes. Builders used clay or cast iron pipes, which easily cracked due to ground movement or poor installation. Through these cracks, sewage seeped into the soil around the foundation. In addition, many homes lacked effective siphons or vent pipes as we know them today. This allowed gases from the sewer system, known as miasmas, to enter the living quarters. These gases were not only unpleasant, but were also believed to cause many diseases. Architects and engineers experimented with various designs for flush tanks and toilets, but these systems were often unreliable. They could become clogged, break, or fail, requiring constant repairs and creating unsanitary conditions in the home. The problem was not only in the mansion itself, but also in the city infrastructure. Street sewers were often overloaded, and the wastewater treatment system was either absent or extremely inefficient. As a result, many mansions stood next to sources of infection. Some builders, trying to save money, connected sewage not to the central sewer system, but to primitive cesspools. Such pits quickly overflowed and became a source of foul odors and disease-causing bacteria, especially during the warm season. It is paradoxical. A mansion, which was supposed to be a model of cleanliness and order, was often surrounded by an invisible threat coming from underground. The owners lived in luxury, but in constant proximity to unsanitary conditions, which they often did not even suspect. The sewage problem was one of the reasons for the high mortality rate from infectious diseases. Even wealthy families were not protected from epidemics that spread through water and sewage. This was the bitter price to pay for attempting to introduce advanced technologies without the appropriate infrastructure. Thus, the majestic facade concealed a time bomb that could undermine the health of all the inhabitants of the house at any moment. Technological progress outpaced engineering thinking, which led to serious consequences. In Victorian mansions, lighting was not just a household detail. It became an evening ordeal, a constant source of anxiety, and a real threat to life. Ironically, the very thing that was supposed to provide comfort, warmth, and a sense of modernity became one of the most dangerous and unpredictable parts of the home. The use of open flames, combined with a huge amount of flammable materials, made these luxurious dwellings a veritable powder keg. The main sources of light were gas horns, kerosene lamps, and of course candles, a must-have attribute of the Victorian era. Each of these options had its own degree of danger. Gas lamps were considered the pinnacle of technological progress. They provided bright, even light that allowed mansion owners to show off their luxurious interiors in the evening hours. But what lay behind this beauty was far less romantic. A complex system of gas pipes ran inside the walls, under the floor, and in the ceilings. These pipes were often poorly sealed, made of poor quality materials, and prone to corrosion. Gas leaks were not just a domestic problem. They were a constant, silent, and virtually invisible threat. Gas could accumulate in the corners of rooms, under stairs, and between wooden panels. Any spark, from a cracked light bulb, an electrostatic discharge, or even a flame in the fireplace, could turn the air in the room into an explosive mixture. Cases where houses burned down in a matter of minutes due to gas leaks were so common that gas workers were feared almost more than firefighters. For residents, a leak did not always mean a loud explosion. Much more often, it led to slow, imperceptible poisoning. People complained of headaches, drowsiness, and weakness, but rarely associated these symptoms with a leak. The gas spread slowly, accumulating at night, and in the morning the owners woke up with a feeling of heaviness in their heads, attributing it all to stuffiness. Kerosene lamps and candles added another layer of danger. The lamps had to be regularly refilled, cleaned, and the wick trimmed. If someone got distracted or overestimated the stability of the lamp, it could fall, spilling kerosene on the floor and instantly creating a stream of fire. Candles were no less dangerous. One sudden movement, an unfortunate brush against a curtain, a candle accidentally left on a dresser, and the fire would flare up almost instantly. This was especially dangerous in winter, when the massive heavy drapes used to protect against the cold were essentially huge wicks, ready to ignite from any spark. When electric lighting began to appear at the end of the Victorian era, it was perceived as a miracle of progress, but the first electrical systems were unreliable, expensive, and downright dangerous. Wiring was laid using makeshift methods, using combustible materials for insulation, such as fabric or oil-soaked paper. Improper installation led to short circuits, overheating wires, and fires that started secretly, inside walls, under floors and ceilings, and spread before anyone noticed. The architecture of Victorian houses only exacerbated the fire hazard. A complex network of corridors, numerous staircases, turrets, attics, and nooks and crannies made the house resemble a maze. In the event of a fire, these architectural features became deadly traps. Smoke filled the narrow passageways faster than people could orient themselves. Many lost their way in the thick, acrid fog, bumping into closed doors, dead ends, or barricaded areas. The wooden structures that formed the basis of many floors and walls burned like dry twigs. The fire spread rapidly, rising up through the voids between the beams and paneling. A house could be completely engulfed in flames in a matter of minutes, so quickly that residents often did not even have time to leave the upper floors. The lack of adequate firefighting equipment exacerbated the situation. Fire brigades were slow and few in number, their equipment was primitive, and access to water was limited. Fire extinguishers as such were just appearing and were extremely ineffective. Often, the only means of fighting the fire were buckets of sand and water placed in the corridors, a kind of ritual gesture that was of little use in a real fire. By the time the firefighters arrived, the carriage had already been reduced to a red-hot skeleton. Thus, life in these magnificent, resplendent houses was associated with a constant, almost invisible mortal danger. Lighting, a symbol of progress, comfort, and status, became a source of anxiety from which neither wealth, position, nor careful precautions could save. Every evening, when lighting a lamp or turning the lever of a gas horn, people were literally playing with fire, in the most dangerous sense of the word. Victorian mansions were perhaps the most striking example of architectural incongruity between external aesthetics and internal function. Every element of the facade screamed wealth and taste, but at the same time made the house less suitable for comfortable living. This era was a time of eclecticism, a mixture of styles. Architects were inspired by Gothic, Renaissance, and other historical periods, combining them in a single design. As a result, a house could be overloaded with decorative details that served no functional purpose. Heavy, massive facades, which created a sense of immovability and monumentality, actually served as conduits for cold and moisture. Stone or facing brick looked majestic, but was a terrible insulator. Functionality was sacrificed for ostentatious style. The huge tall windows we mentioned earlier were necessary to visually match the scale of the building, but they were bad in terms of heat conservation. Architects knew this, but couldn't give up this element because it was too important for creating the desired impression. The interior layout was often confusing and illogical, with many rooms, staircases, and corridors. This was due to a clear division of functions: rooms for the owners, rooms for the servants, living rooms, dining rooms, libraries, smoking rooms. Each room had its own purpose. This complex structure made the house impractical and difficult to navigate. To get from the bedroom to the dining room, one had to walk through several unheated corridors. Functionally, this was inefficient, but it was in line with strict Victorian etiquette. Even the furniture and interior design followed this logic. They were massive, richly decorated, but often uncomfortable. Heavy fabrics, thick wallpaper, and intricate draperies were a tribute to fashion rather than comfort. Thus, the Victorian mansion was, in essence, an architectural manifesto. It was designed to be admired from the outside and to display wealth on the inside, not to be comfortable to live in. It was a theatrical performance in which comfort was only a secondary backdrop. Today, many Victorian mansions have either been demolished or undergone such extensive renovation that only their external contours remain of their original appearance. This has become the most convincing proof that the original design of these buildings was fundamentally flawed. The legacy of Victorian architecture turned out to be much more complex than just impressive facades and decorative elements. Behind the beauty lay serious engineering miscalculations, weak materials, and a complete misunderstanding of the thermodynamics of living spaces. By the mid-20th century, when there was a breakthrough in heating technology, insulation materials, and building standards, it became clear how inefficient Victorian-era homes were for modern lifestyles. The owners of such buildings faced exorbitant heating costs. Trying to heat huge rooms with giant windows, cold walls, and numerous hidden gaps turned into a daily struggle. In addition to dampness, there were problems with drafts, freezing walls, mold, and condensation. Improper ventilation, whether intentional or unintentional, allowed the cold to penetrate the interior virtually unchecked. Any attempt to maintain a comfortable temperature resulted in endless bills for coal, gas, or electricity. Finally, the old engineering solutions began to crumble before our eyes. Wooden structures rotted, metal elements rusted, and the foundation, deprived of waterproofing, gradually absorbed moisture and subsided. It gradually became clear that many Victorian mansions simply did not meet the requirements of modern housing. High ceilings designed for aesthetic effect created enormous volumes of air that were impossible to heat efficiently. Huge rooms connected by narrow corridors and illogical passageways were the result of architectural fashion rather than functionality. The biggest problem, however, was structural miscalculations. Uneven settlement, weak floors, overloaded walls, and outdated engineering systems made the houses a burden rather than an asset. It is not surprising that tens of thousands of such buildings were demolished in the mid-20th century. They were replaced by new buildings, simpler, less decorative, but much more practical and energy efficient. The solution seemed radical, but in most cases, it was economically justified. Renovating an old mansion often cost more than building a new house. In essence, most of these buildings were turned into new houses within old walls. The facade was preserved, but the interior was completely replaced. Only a few mansions have been preserved in their relatively original condition, and even then, at the cost of constant maintenance and modernization of hidden engineering systems. Modern architects studying the Victorian style learned valuable lessons from its mistakes. They learned to combine aesthetics and functionality in such a way that the house was not only pleasing to the eye, but also comfortable, warm, and safe. Instead of massive stone masonry as a load-bearing element, modern materials with low thermal conductivity are used today, and brick and stone serve only as decorative cladding. Ventilated facades, energy-efficient windows, modern insulation methods, and thoughtful architecture that takes into account the climate and terrain are also used. Ultimately, the Victorian era left us with more than just magnificent palaces, delightful facades, and romantic silhouettes of turrets. It left us with a much more important lesson. Architecture should serve people, rather than being a slavish attempt to keep up with fashion or aesthetic fantasies. Beauty cannot be achieved at the expense of safety, health, and comfort. Today, we admire surviving Victorian houses as monuments of history and art, but we do so through the prism of modern technology, which allows us to live in them without cold, dampness, and endless drafts. Without this technology, they would remain majestic but icy and uncomfortable labyrinths of the past. A reminder of a time when architecture strove for beauty, forgetting about people. We have examined in detail how Victorian mansions were actually built and why these symbols of wealth and luxury were in fact examples of architectural inefficiency. We have seen that behind the beautiful facades lay icy stone walls, insurmountable drafts, drainage problems, and inhuman labor conditions for workers. Which of the problems with Victorian mansions that we discussed today do you think is the most serious? Was it the cold from the stone walls, the constant dampness, or the high risk of fire? Share your opinion in the comments and don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on new research into the architectural mysteries of the past.